The shuttle docked at Station Helix 7 with a gentle shudder, and Katie Dawson grabbed her bag from the overhead compartment before making her way toward the exit, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit as she stepped onto the metal platform that would be her home for the next 2 years. The Galactic Coalition Military Academy stretched out before her in every direction. A massive structure of gleaming corridors and training facilities where species from across the galaxy came together to learn the art of war and the science of peace. And Katie had dreamed of this moment since she was a little girl sitting on her grandfather's knee listening to stories about the stars. She was 22 years old with brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Average height, and nothing about her appearance suggested she was anything special, which was exactly how she wanted it, because she had come here to prove herself on her own terms without anyone knowing her family name or her history. Thalkori. Cadet walked past her and deliberately bumped her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble. And when she looked up, she saw him smirking down at her with his 4 eyes and gray-scaled skin. "Watch where you stand, soft skin," he growled, and his companions laughed as they continued walking without looking back. Katie said nothing and simply adjusted her bag on her shoulder before continuing toward the registration center. Because she had expected this kind of treatment, and she was prepared for it. Humans had only joined the Galactic Coalition 30 years ago after the First Contact War, and many species still viewed Earth as a backwater planet full of primitive creatures who had no business mixing with the advanced civilizations of the galaxy. And changing that perception was exactly why Katie had come here. The registration process took 3 hours and involved biometric scans and psychological evaluations, and more forms than Katie thought possible. But finally, she received her room, assignment, and her training schedule and her gray cadet uniform. Her room was small but clean, with a single bed and a desk and a window that looked out at the stars. And as she unpacked her few belongings, she heard a knock at her door. "Come in," she called, and the door slid open to reveal a young man about her age with short blonde hair and a friendly smile. "Hey there, I'm Ben Harper from Texas," he said, extending his hand. "I saw you come in on the shuttle and figured we humans should stick together around here. You know what I mean?" Katie shook his hand and nodded, appreciating his warmth, even as she reminded herself not to get too close to anyone, because attachments could complicate her mission. "Katie Dawson," she said simply. "Nice to meet you." Ben glanced at her forearm, where her sleeve had ridden up slightly, and his eyes widened at the tattoo visible there, a wolf skull with crossed rifles and a name written beneath it in bold letters. "That's some ink," he said with curiosity in his voice. "Danny Cole, is that someone special to you?" Katie quickly pulled her sleeve down and turned away to continue unpacking. "Just someone who mattered," she said quietly. "It's not something I like to talk about." Ben seemed to sense her discomfort and changed the subject, talking instead about the training schedule and the different species they would be learning alongside, and his hopes of becoming a pilot someday. Over the following weeks, Katie settled into the routine of academy life, waking early for physical training and attending classes on galactic history and alien physiology and combat tactics. And she excelled quietly in every simulation and every test, without drawing attention to herself. But avoiding attention was impossible when you were human at Station Helix 7, because the prejudice against Earth natives ran deep and wide. The Thalkori, who had bumped her on her first day, was named Varax, and he was the son of a decorated military commander who had lost soldiers to human forces during a border skirmish years ago, and he made it his personal mission to remind every human cadet that they were inferior and unwelcome. "Look at the softskins pretending to be soldiers," Varax would say loudly in the mess hall whenever human cadets walked past. "On my world, we use creatures like them for target practice." His companions would laugh, and the human cadets would keep their heads down because reporting the behavior to commanders rarely changed anything. Since many of the alien officers shared similar views, even if they didn't express them so openly, Katie watched it all with quiet eyes and clenched fists hidden under the table. And Ben would sometimes look at her with confusion because he could tell she wanted to act, but something was holding her back. "Why don't you say something?" Ben asked her one evening as they walked back to the dormitory. "I've seen you in the combat simulations, Katie. You're better than anyone in our class, including Vorax and his whole crew combined. So why do you let them treat us like garbage?" Katie stopped walking and looked up at the stars visible through the station's observation windows. "Because being able to hurt someone doesn't mean you should," she said softly. "And because I made a promise to someone that I would earn my place here the right way, through patience and excellence, not through violence." Ben shook his head, but didn't argue, because he could see the pain behind her words, even if he didn't understand it. The next day in the mess hall, Varax went further than he ever had before. And when a young human cadet named Tyler Grant accidentally spilled water near his table, Varax grabbed him by the collar and threw him against the wall with enough force to crack the metal panels. "Filthy human," the Varax snarled. "On your home planet you crawl in the mud and eat insects, and here you dare to dirty my space with your clumsiness." Tyler tried to apologize, but Varax silenced him with a backhand across the face that sent blood spraying across the floor. And the alien cadets laughed while the human cadets looked away in fear and shame. Katie stood up from her seat. And for a moment the entire mess hall went silent as everyone watched to see what she would do, but she only walked over to Tyler and helped him to his feet before guiding him toward the exit without a single word or glance at Varax. And behind her she heard the Thalkori laughing louder than ever. "That's right, Softskin," Varax called after her. "Run away like the coward you are, like all humans are, and take your broken friend with you." Katie's hands trembled as she walked, but she kept moving because the time was not right, and the promise she had made still echoed in her heart. And somewhere in the stars her grandfather was watching and waiting to see if she had the strength to be patient. But patience, she knew, could only last so long before even the strongest dam had to break. The medical bay was quiet except for the hum of healing machines as Katie sat beside Tyler's bed and watched the doctors work on his broken ribs and fractured cheekbone. And she felt a cold anger building in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Tyler was only 19 years old and had joined the academy because he wanted to make his family proud. And now he lay unconscious with tubes connected to his body because a bully decided that humans were acceptable targets for violence. "You could have stopped him," said a voice from the doorway. And Katie turned to see Commander Lyra Voss standing there with her arms crossed and a knowing look in her eyes. Commander Voss was one of the few humans in a senior position at the academy. A tall woman with silver streaks in her dark hair and scars on her hands that told stories of battles survived. "I could have," Katie admitted quietly. "But that's not why I'm here." Commander Voss walked closer and pulled up a chair beside her. "I know why you're here, Cadet Dawson, and I know what that tattoo on your arm means, even if no one else does. But there's a difference between patience and allowing harm to continue." Katie looked down at her forearm where the wolf skull and crossed rifles were hidden beneath her sleeve. "He told me that the hardest battle is the one where you have to hold back," she said. "He told me that anyone can throw a punch, but only the truly strong can absorb one without responding." "Danny Cole was a wise man," Commander Voss said softly. "But even he knew there were limits, and even he eventually had to fight." Katie didn't respond because she knew the commander was right. And she knew that her patience was wearing thin with every passing day over. The next 2 weeks, Varax's behavior grew worse because he sensed that the humans would not fight back. And he took that as proof of their weakness rather than their. Restrained, he tripped human cadets in the corridors and mocked them during training exercises and spread rumors that Earth was planning to betray the coalition, and his companions followed his lead. until the anti-human sentiment at the academy reached levels that made even some of the alien officers uncomfortable. Katie continued to excel in her classes and her combat simulations, scoring higher than any cadet in her year, including Varax. And this only made the Thalkori angrier, because he could not accept that a human might be better than him at anything. She cheats, Varax told anyone who would listen. All humans cheat because they are too weak and stupid to succeed honestly. And one day, I will prove it. Ben tried to convince Katie to report the harassment to the Coalition Oversight Committee. But Katie refused because she knew that such reports often went nowhere and sometimes made things worse for the humans who filed them. "Just give me time," she told Ben. "Everything will change soon, I promise." But time ran out. On a cold evening when Katie was walking alone through the lower corridors of the station on her way back from a late study session, Varax stepped out of the shadows with 3 of his companions blocking the path behind her, and his 4 eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction as he looked down at her. "Well, well," he said with a voice like grinding stones. The quiet little human all alone without her friends to hide behind. "What a perfect opportunity for us to have a conversation." Katie stopped walking and faced him calmly. "I have nothing to say to you, Varax, so please move aside and let me pass." Varax laughed, and his companions laughed with him. "You think you can give orders to me, Softskin? You think because you score well on simulations that makes you my equal?" He stepped closer until he was towering over her, and Katie could smell the strange sharp scent of his species and see the hatred burning in his eyes. "I've been watching you," Varax continued. "I've seen you hold back when you could fight. And I've seen that pathetic tattoo you try to hide on your arm. So tell me, human, who is Danny Cole? Was he your lover who died crying like a weakling?" Katie's expression changed in an instant, the calm mask falling away to reveal something cold and hard beneath. And for the first time, Varax saw something in her eyes that made him hesitate. "Don't speak his name," Katie said quietly. "You don't have the right." But Varax was too arrogant to recognize the warning, too certain of his own superiority to understand that he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "Danny Cole," he repeated with mockery dripping from every word. "Danny Cole, Danny Cole. What kind of pathetic human name is that? I bet he begged for his life at the end like all your kind do." Katie took a slow breath and forced herself to step back. "This is your one chance to walk away," she said with a voice like ice. "Take it." Varax responded by striking her across the face with the back of his scaled hand. A blow that would have knocked a normal human unconscious and sent them sprawling to the floor, but Katie did not fall. She stumbled back 1 step and then stood firm. And when she raised her head, there was blood on her lip, but her eyes were steady and clear and filled with something that made all 4 of Varax's eyes widen. With sudden uncertainty, "You have no idea what you just did," Katie said quietly. Behind Varax, his companions began to shift nervously because they had noticed something he had not. And that something was the group of senior officers who had turned the corner, just in time to witness the assault. Commander Voss was among them, and beside her stood officers from 3 different species. And all of them were staring at Katie's forearm, where her sleeve had torn during the impact to reveal her tattoo and fold of wolf skull and crossed rifles gleamed under the corridor lights. And beneath them the name Danny Cole was written in letters that suddenly seemed to burn with meaning. "Oh no," whispered a Velari officer with purple skin and trembling hands. "Oh no, that cannot be what I think it is." Varax turned to look at the officers and saw fear on their faces. Genuine fear directed not at him but at the small human woman he had just struck. And for the first time in his life, he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "What?" he demanded. "What is happening? Why are you all looking at her like that?" Commander Voss stepped forward with her jaw set tight. "Because you fool, she said with barely controlled fury. "You just struck the granddaughter of the most dangerous human who ever lived. And now you can learn exactly why the galaxy learned to fear that name." The conference room on the upper level of the Academy was filled with tension as Admiral Nathan Cross stood before a holographic display that cast blue light across the faces of the gathered cadets and officers. And Katie sat in the corner with her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on the floor. Admiral Cross was a tall man in his 60s, with white hair and a chest full of medals that told the story of a lifetime spent defending humanity. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of history. 30 years ago, he began. The Kreth Dominion looked at Earth and saw an easy target. They saw a primitive species that had barely reached beyond their own moon. And they decided that humanity would make excellent slaves. The holographic display shifted to show images of massive Kreth warships descending through Earth's atmosphere, their weapons burning cities and their soldiers marching through the streets with weapons that made human technology look like toys. They landed an invasion force of 50,000 soldiers in the western region of North America, Admiral Cross continued. And they expected to conquer the entire continent within a week. But they made one critical mistake. He paused and looked directly at Varax, who sat rigid with his companions at the front of the room. They underestimated what humans are capable of when everything they love is threatened. The display changed again to show a mountain range with a narrow pass cutting through it. And in that pass stood a small group of human soldiers who looked impossibly tiny compared to the army approaching them. The Battle of Phoenix Valley, Admiral Cross said quietly. The Kreth needed to pass through that valley to reach the civilian evacuation routes where 2 million men, women, and children were fleeing for their lives. And standing in their way was a team of 12 soldiers led by a man named Danny Cole. Katie lifted her eyes for the first time and watched the display as footage began to play. Grainy and damaged, but clear enough to show what happened next. Danny Cole was a lean man with sharp eyes and a calm expression that never changed even as thousands of enemy soldiers advanced on his position. And he moved through the battlefield like a ghost, striking and vanishing and striking again while his team held the line around him for 3 days and 3 nights. Admiral Cross narrated. Danny Cole and his team fought without rest and without retreat. And when they ran out of ammunition, they used knives and rocks and their bare hands. Because giving up was simply not something humans know how to do. The display showed Cole taking down Kreth soldiers with movements that seemed almost impossible, his body flowing from one target to the next with a precision that made the alien officers in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Kreth had never encountered anything like him. Admiral Cross said. They had conquered dozens of species across the galaxy, and none had ever resisted the way Danny Cole resisted. None had ever looked death in the face and simply refused to accept it. Varax watched the footage with growing horror as he saw Cole kill enemy after enemy with techniques that no one should have been able to perform. And he began to understand why the senior officers had gone pale at the sight of Katie's tattoo. By the end of the 3rd day, Admiral Cross continued, Danny Cole had personally killed over 400 Kreth soldiers, and his team had accounted for thousands more. And the enemy army that had expected to sweep through the valley in hours was instead broken and demoralized and terrified of a species they had thought would be easy prey. The display showed the final moments of the battle, when Cole stood alone among the bodies of fallen Kreth with wounds covering his body and blood soaking his uniform. And he activated his communicator to send one last message. His voice crackled through the room speakers, rough and tired, but filled with an iron determination that sent chills down the spines of everyone listening. They can have this ground when they pry it from my cold hands. Danny Cole said in the recording. And even then, I'll haunt them. The footage showed him charging into the final wave of Kreth soldiers with nothing but a combat knife. And then the recording cut to static. Danny Cole fell that day, Admiral Cross said into the silence that followed. But the 2 million civilians he was protecting reached safety, and the Kreth Dominion never recovered from what they experienced in Phoenix Valley. He turned off the display and faced the room directly. Within 6 months, the Kreth signed a peace treaty with Earth, and within a year they had withdrawn from human space entirely. Not because we had superior technology or greater numbers, but because they learned that fighting humans was simply not worth the cost. The Admiral walked toward Katie and placed his hand on her shoulder with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence they had just witnessed. Danny Cole became a legend, he said, and the unit he founded, Alpha Force, became the most feared special operations force in the known galaxy. And his granddaughter has been a member of that unit for 3 years before she came to this academy. Gasps filled the room as the alien cadets and officers processed this information. And Varax's gray scales seemed to turn almost white with shock. Katie Dawson could have killed you in that corridor, Admiral Cross said directly to Varax. She could have broken every bone in your body before you even realized you were in danger. Because she was trained by the same program her grandfather created, and she has completed missions that would make your border skirmishes look like playground games. Katie finally stood and faced the room. And now that everyone knew who she was, they could see the resemblance. The same sharp eyes and the same calm expression that never wavered even under pressure. I came to this academy because Alpha Force asked me to, she said quietly. They wanted someone to show the galaxy that humans are more than just warriors, that we can work alongside other species and build something better than what we had before. She looked at Varax, and there was no anger in her eyes, only a deep sadness. I wanted to change minds through patience and excellence. But I see now that some minds refuse to change, no matter how much patience you show them. Varax stood abruptly, and his chair clattered to the floor behind him. This changes nothing, he snarled with desperation creeping into his voice. I don't care who your grandfather was. I don't care what unit you belong to. You're still just a human. Admiral Cross raised an eyebrow. Is that so, Cadet Varax? Then I suppose you won't mind the formal complaint we're filing with the Coalition about your assault on a fellow cadet, or the investigation into your pattern of harassment against human personnel. Varax's companions edged away from him as if his mere presence had become dangerous. And for the first time since arriving at the academy, the Thalkari bully found himself completely and utterly alone. The news spread through Station Helix 7 like fire through dry grass. And by the next morning, every cadet and officer at the academy knew that the quiet human woman who had endured months of harassment was actually a trained killer from the most dangerous military unit in the galaxy. Katie walked to breakfast through corridors that had once been hostile and now fell silent as she passed, with alien cadets pressing themselves against the walls to give her room and officers nodding respectfully where they had once ignored her existence. It was everything she had not wanted been caught up with her outside the mess hall and fell into step beside her with a mixture of awe and confusion on his face. Why didn't you tell me? He asked quietly. I've been your friend for months, and you never mentioned that you were Alpha Force or that your grandfather was Danny Cole. Katie sighed and pushed open the door to the mess hall. Because I didn't come here as Danny Cole's granddaughter or as an Alpha Force operative. I came here as Katie Dawson, a cadet who wanted to earn respect through hard work and patience. And now that's all ruined. The mess hall fell silent as they entered, and Katie grabbed a tray and moved through the food line as if nothing had changed. But she could feel hundreds of eyes following her every movement. The Lari cadet, who had once laughed at Varax's jokes about humans, approached her table with trembling hands and a look of shame on his purple face. I wanted to apologize, he said nervously, for everything. For laughing and for not stopping him and for being part of something so wrong. Katie looked up at him and saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "Sit down and eat with us if you want." The Valari's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly sat down across from Katie and Ben. And within minutes, other alien cadets began to approach and offer their own apologies and ask if they could join the table. It was progress. Katie thought, but it was progress born from fear rather than understanding. And she knew that fear was a poor foundation for lasting change. Later, that day, Commander Vuss summoned Katie to her office for a private conversation. And when Katie arrived, she found the commander standing at the window, looking out at the stars with a troubled expression. "Varax's father has contacted the academy," Commander Voss said without turning around. "General Throck of the Thalkori 3rd Fleet, a decorated warrior who lost 50 soldiers to Alpha Force during the boundary dispute 7 years ago." Katie nodded slowly. "I know who he is. My unit studied his tactics during training. He's brilliant but arrogant, and he raised his son to hate humans." Commander Voss finally turned to face her. "General Throck is demanding that the assault charges be dropped. He claims his son was provoked by your mere presence at the academy, and that humans should not be allowed to hold positions that might lead to them commanding Thalkori soldiers." "That's ridiculous," Katie said flatly. "Of course it is," Commander Voss agreed. "But the general has influence in the Coalition Council, and he's using that influence to protect his son. So the Admiral has suggested a compromise." Katie felt her stomach tighten because she already knew what was coming. "A combat trial," Commander Voss nodded grimly. "Under Coalition law, you have the right to challenge Varax to formal combat for the assault he committed against you. And if you defeat him, the charges will be considered settled, and his family will have no grounds for complaint. And if I refuse the challenge, then the political pressure will likely result in the charges being dropped anyway. And Varax will return to his studies with his pride intact and his hatred of humans stronger than ever." Katie was silent for a long moment as she considered her options. And finally, she asked the question that mattered most. "What do you think my grandfather would do?" Commander Voss smiled sadly. "Danny Cole never walked away from a fight that needed to be fought. But he also never fought for pride or revenge, so the question isn't what he would do. It's what you believe is right." 2 hours later, Katie stood in the corridor outside Varax's quarters and knocked firmly on the door. And when it slid open, she saw the Thalkori standing there with surprise and suspicion, battling for dominance on his face. "What do you want?" "Human," he growled, though there was less confidence in his voice than before. "I want to offer you a choice," Katie said calmly. "You can publicly apologize to every human cadet you've harassed and spend the rest of your time at this academy, working alongside us as equals. Or you can face me in a combat trial." Varax's scales flushed dark with anger. "You think I would apologize to softskins? You think I would lower myself to treat your pathetic species as my equals?" "I think you're smarter than you pretend to be," Katie replied. "And I think somewhere beneath all that hatred, there's a warrior who knows the difference between strength and cruelty." For a moment, something flickered in Varax's 4 eyes. Something that might have been doubt or fear, or even the beginning of understanding. But then his pride reasserted itself, and his face hardened into a mask of contempt. "My father lost friends to your unit," he said coldly. "Good soldiers who died because humans refused to accept their proper place in the galaxy. And now you stand here offering me mercy as if you're being generous. But I see through you. Human." He stepped forward until he was looming over her just as he had in the corridor when he struck her. "Your mercy is just another form of weakness. A way to avoid a fight you're afraid you might lose. Because despite all your training and all your grandfather's legend, you're still just a softskin who bleeds red." Katie looked up at him without flinching. "So you're refusing my offer?" "I'm doing more than that," Varax declared loudly enough for the cadets in nearby rooms to hear. I formally challenge you to a combat trial under Article 7 of the Coalition Military Code. And when I defeat you, every human at this academy will know that Danny Cole's legacy died with a whimper in his granddaughter's failure. Katie nodded slowly and felt a weight settle onto her shoulders. The weight of legacy and expectation and the knowledge that tomorrow she would have to become the weapon her grandfather had taught her to be. Tomorrow, then, she said quietly. May the best warrior win. She turned and walked away while Varak shouted insults at her back. And she did not stop or respond because she was already thinking about the fight to come and the lesson she would teach the galaxy about what it truly meant to be a warrior. The combat arena at the heart of Station Helix 7 was a massive circular chamber with transparent walls that allowed thousands of spectators to watch from tiered galleries above. And on this day, every seat was filled with cadets and officers and diplomats who had traveled from across the sector to witness the fight. Katie stood at one end of the arena in her simple gray training uniform with her hands loose at her sides and her breathing slow and steady. And she looked so small and unremarkable that many of the alien spectators whispered doubts about whether she could possibly survive what was coming at the other end. Varax paced back and forth like a caged predator, his massive scaled body rippling with muscle and his four eyes burning with hatred. And he wore the traditional combat harness of Thalkori warriors that left his arms and chest bare to show off his impressive physique. Ben watched from the Khan's gallery with his hands gripped tight on the railing and fear in his eyes. She's half his size, he said to Commander Voss, who stood beside him. How is she supposed to fight someone like that? Commander Voss did not take her eyes off the arena. Watch and learn, Cadet Harper. You're about to see why the galaxy fears Alpha Force, the officiating officer. A tall Velari with ceremonial robes stepped to the center of the arena and raised his hands for silence. This combat trial is conducted under Article 7 of the Coalition Military Code, he announced. The fight will continue until one combatant yields or is rendered unable to continue. There are no weapons allowed and no assistance from outside the arena. Do both parties understand and accept these terms? I accept, Katie said calmly. I accept. Varax growled with anticipation dripping from his voice. And I will enjoy breaking this human slowly. The official retreated to the edge of the arena and raised a signal flag. Begin. Vorax charged immediately with the thundering force of a freight train, his massive arms reaching out to grab Katie and crush her in his grip. And the alien spectators roared with approval at his aggressive display of power. But Katie was no longer where she had been standing. She moved like water flowing around a stone, stepping to the side at the last possible moment and letting Varax's momentum carry him past her while her hand flicked out to strike a point on his neck that made his left arm go numb. Varax stumbled and spun around with confusion joining the anger on his face. Hold still, coward. Katie didn't respond with words and instead circled slowly to his weakened side, her eyes tracking every twitch of his muscles and every shift of his weight. He charged again, and this time he was smarter, feinting left before sweeping right with a devastating backhand that would have shattered Katie's skull if it had connected. Did not connect. Katie dropped into a roll that carried her beneath his arm and came up behind him with 3 rapid strikes to pressure points along his spine that made his legs buckle for a moment before his strength reasserted itself. The alien spectators had gone quiet because they were beginning to understand what they were watching. And it was not a fight between two warriors. It was a demonstration of absolute superiority. Varax attacked again and again with increasing desperation, using techniques that had won him championships on his homeworld and made him the most feared fighter at the academy. But nothing worked against the small human woman, who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. She was not fighting to win quickly. The spectators realized with growing horror. She was fighting to teach every time Varax attacked. She let him get close enough to feel hope before dismantling his technique with surgical precision, showing him and everyone watching exactly how many ways she could have ended the fight if she had chosen to do so. "Stop playing with me," Varax screamed as blood dripped from a dozen small wounds that Katie had opened with her strikes. "Fight me like a real warrior." Katie stopped moving and stood perfectly still in the center of the arena. And when she spoke, her voice carried clearly to every corner of the chamber. "A real warrior doesn't need to prove her strength by destroying someone weaker," she said. "A real warrior proves her strength by choosing when to fight and when to show mercy." Varax roared and launched himself at her with everything he had left, abandoning technique for pure rage-fueled violence. What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for generations. Katie moved through his attack like a dancer, redirecting his force with subtle touches that turned his own momentum against him. And in the span of 3 heartbeats, she had him on his back with her boot on his throat and her hand poised above his face in a position that everyone recognized as lethal. The arena was utterly silent. Varax stared up at her with terror in his 4 eyes, because he knew with absolute certainty that he was about to die, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But Katie did not strike. Instead, she spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "My grandfather didn't fight so humans could become bullies. He fought so we'd have the right to offer peace instead of war. And today I'm choosing peace." She removed her boot from his throat and extended her hand to help him up. And the entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Varax lay there for a long moment, broken in pride, but suddenly seeing the human woman above him in an entirely new light. And slowly he reached up and took her hand. She pulled him to his feet and held his gaze without fear or hatred. "You can keep hating us if you want," she said quietly. "Or you can learn what we could build together if we stop trying to destroy each other." Varax was silent for a long time, and then he did something that no one expected. He placed his fist over his heart in the Thalkori gesture of respect between warriors. "I was wrong," he said roughly, "about you and about your kind, and I have much to learn." The arena erupted in cheers and applause that drowned out everything else, and Katie allowed herself a small smile as she returned the gesture. 3 weeks later, she sat in the academy gardens, watching a group of cadets train together on the lawn below. Human and Thalkori and Valari working side by side, with Varax calling out encouragement to a young human cadet struggling with a difficult techniquer. Communicator buzzed with an incoming message from Alpha Force Command, and she read it with a warmth spreading through her chest. "Well done, Cadet Cole," the message said. "Your grandfather would be proud. Mission accomplished." Katie touched the tattoo on her forearm and looked up at the stars that her grandfather had given his life to protect. And she knew that his legacy was not about the enemies he had killed, but about the future he had made possible. A future where humans and aliens could stand together not as enemies, but as allies. United not by fear, but by the understanding that true strength lies in the choice to extend a hand instead of a fist, and somewhere in the stars, she felt certain, Danny Cole was smiling.